Hello, back again for video 2. So we're going to pick up with this discussion of everyday use. I'm going to try to dive back in sort of where I left off and just kind of finish out the presentation here. So we were talking about, as one of the themes of everyday use, this generational divide and how that sort of became a I want to say a boiling point, I guess, if you will, between the older and younger generation during this Black Power movement in the late 60s and early 70s. But what it really comes down to is something that's at the heart of every story, which is, what do the characters want? Yearning is that central drive that compels the conflict of every single story. We have to have conflict or we don't have a story. So that means there has to be some element of yearning there. The characters are wanting something. They're wanting something that they don't have currently in their lives. So I think it would be something good for you to be thinking about as you read through this story, which is looking at maybe all three of these central characters. We've got the mother. We've got the oldest daughter, Dee, who has come home from college. We've got the younger sister who still lives at home with her mother. What is it that each of these characters want? And what does the mother want, let's say, for herself? And what does she want for her daughter? Now, let's think about the daughter, Dee. What does she want? And what does she want for, let's say, her mother and her sister? And are those necessarily lining up? Is what she wants for her mother the same thing that her mother wants for herself? Again, these are all questions that we have to raise and that will be very useful for you in working through the story to try to determine what those answers are. Now, anytime we're talking about story, we're looking at theme as that universal truth that the story is trying to convey about us, our human lives, what it means to be who we are. But oftentimes those themes will manifest through the use of symbolism. And a symbol is really just it's an object that stands for some abstract concept. And in fiction, that abstract concept is usually tied to the theme. So in this instance, if we say, okay, well, one of the themes is heritage, and another theme maybe is family, which those are two closely related ideas, right? But they're both abstract ideas. So what is that tangible thing in the story that we're able to latch onto to represent these ideas? In this case, it's the quilts and some of the various other objects that are in the family home that have been passed down from their ancestors. And these are the things that Dee decides that she's entitled to when she comes home, even though she never had any interest in them before. So the quilts in particular play that symbolic role. They're the thing that Dee wants. She covets them, and she tries to argue why she deserves them more than her sister Maggie, even though Dee could not really tell you who made the quilts, right, or really anything about them. She just knows all of a sudden they have value because they're a trendy thing now. Everybody's hanging their grandmother's quilts in their homes. But what does that really mean? You can take an item, and hence the title of the story, you can take an item that once had everyday use for people. It had practical value. Think of something like a quilt. A quilt it has beauty, yes, but it also served a practical purpose. It was something that would keep you warm on a cold night. So do these things continue to have value because of what they can do for us practically? Should we take a quilt that a grandmother has made by hand and use it on a cold night because that's what it was meant for? Or should we just hang it up like an item in a museum? Something that then essentially becomes dead because it has no more use. So it comes down to this conflict, right, between these two sisters about what the quilts should be for. Should they be gifted to Maggie, who, as Dee argues, will simply put them to everyday use and therefore they will wear out quickly? Or should they be hung in well, I say hung in a museum, but it's the same thing, hung on a wall for a decoration, right? And never used again. Is that what the ancestors would have wanted? Well, there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to look at that. I think in this story, I think Alice Walker does take a position on that. And it's definitely something that I think we can debate as a class, as we think about this story. But I said here the quilts raise a big question. How do we best honor items passed down by our ancestors? By actually using them as they were intended, or by hanging them in a museum or on a wall where they become merely relics? And then, part of our activity for this week is that I'd like for you to think about what items have been passed down in your family. And how have those items been preserved? Are they still used? Or, are they merely for show, as the case may be? Is it still something that you wear? Sometimes jewelry is passed down in families. Is it something that is put to some practical use? Recipes often are passed down in families from grandmothers to mothers to daughters. What are some of those things that have been passed down? Photographs. I mean, those are family heirlooms. In some cases, even just stories that have been passed down. It can be a little bit different for every family, but what are some of those things, that you might want to think about in your family? Now, as we get into next week, we're going to be looking at some other works. We're going to be looking at some essays, and we're going to look at this episode from Sanford and Son from back in 1973, which also parodies the Black Power movement. This episode actually came out the same year as Alice Walker's story. So I want us to, really look at that and do this comparison and contrast, because you're going to see a lot of the same themes echo here. And even the characters, to some extent, parallel what we see in the story, right? Between this father and son. So it's kind of the same scenario, it's just the genders are reversed. So in this case, we've got a son who is going through this identity crisis and trying to embrace his Africanism, but not really understanding very much about it. And we've got also, again, a parent who just doesn't understand why the need for this identity crisis. So we'll definitely be looking at that next week and how this kind of bumps up against Alice Walker's story and what we can take from that and how we can synthesize the two works as part of your literary analysis project. All right, so I'm going to leave you to read the story now. That's going to be your job. First of all, read the story so that we can talk about it. So definitely try to have that read by Monday, and of course your assessment is actually due for Friday night by 11:59 p.m. So I'm trying to think here. You may or may not need to go ahead and get the story read before you do the assignment, because I think the assignment is really just going to ask you some kind of generalized questions. But you'll still need to click on the story and skim through it. You know, even if it's just a quick read, you'll need to open that link before it will let you move on to the discussion assignment. But definitely you need to have the whole story read before we talk again on Monday. Okay. All right. So that's going to be your module for this week. I've given you some things to think about here, and I'll be interested in hearing what you have to say about this come Monday. Bye-bye, y'all.